It's true, I'm fairly new to this civilian life. I only retired in January to take up the head of programme management in the NHS for Mid-Essex. But before that, being an environmental health practitioner in the Royal Air Force and doing many operations and going out to these places such as deserts and things, obviously that different. My point is though, is that I'm doing yet again another climatic injuries or climatic health effects. Other times it was like heat stress and trench foot, and now I've gone to cold damp homes in Essex. But the science is quite similar, so hopefully you'll bear with me. So let's what I'm going to go through today. Quick introduction about what I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about who we believe is at risk from cold. I'm actually talking about the effects, the health effects. Not talking about cold damp homes or the reasons for or what's and why, that'll come later. I'm just talking about the health effects. I'm going to talk about mortality versus morbidity and what we have. And then I'm going to talk specifically about cold damp and the effects that has on the population. And some other conditions as well we'll sweep up with. But before that, I think what I'd like to do is just show you a video.
There are 1,204 winter deaths, and that's a disaster. It means that every year the figure of winter deaths is going up. George Osborne will be giving his new figures on the 29th of November. He should withdraw this decision to cut the winter fuel allowance. The National Pensioners Convention called for a £500 fuel allowance for people because that would be more in keeping with the price of fuel. You also have to tackle, of course, these companies that are constantly increasing the costs and actually making a lot of money out of it.
We learned today that over 25,000 extra people died last winter because they were cold in their homes. And this is a crisis, and it's a crisis that's only going to get worse as the big six energy companies push up fuel bills and the government cuts the kind of support that people need to stay warm in their homes. If we insulate homes, people don't have to spend as much money on fuel bills, and people keep warm and they stay alive.
I think that Greenpeace and the National Pensioners Convention have the same vision, that we don't want a fuel policy which is going to affect our world, that we want a fuel policy which is going to be good for everybody and not spoil the future for our children.
Okay, that was actually made by Greenpeace and the National Pensions Conventions, and you probably think, wow, that's quite emotive and that can't be the whole story. And I'm going to surprise you, I'm going to agree with you a little. I'll agree with you if that's what you thought. I think that was rather left-wing and it didn't explain the whole story and it used quite emotive numbers. But they didn't tell any lies. And I'm going to try and talk through how they get to that. How they get to them numbers and how to understand them, and actually it's such a complex formula to get to these figures. Actually, just to count excess winter deaths, which we're going to talk about, or excess winter mortality as it's now known, is actually fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. It's all the other things that surround it that make it more difficult to calculate and attribute just to winter. Hopefully you are slightly surprised to see who are we talking about. You see, when we think about who's at risk from poor health, cold homes, we generally, or most of the public would normally just jump for the elderly. Yeah? That's the kind of main cohort that they'd have in their mind. But what about children? Children can live in that, but children are strong, surely children are strong, they're great, they're resilient. maybe more so, but they can still suffer. They're still at risk from cold and cold damp environments. And those with long-term conditions, often that is the elderly as well, is elderly with long-term conditions. I believe this in Mid-Essex area, we're talking about 120,000 people in our area who live with a long-term condition, many of them of which live in poor, with a low income. A lot of the times that doesn't. I'm not really including cancer in that. More diabetes and obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and other conditions. They're the ones really we're looking at the LTCs. Right. Okay. Unhelpfully for me, this presentation had to be given in a few weeks ago, and since then the government has come out and actually produced the figures for excess winter deaths. And you've probably seen it. Did you see that in the news the other week? Yeah. Okay. So I actually made this presentation beforehand. It doesn't make a difference, but I'll try and update the figures as we go along. But this was only released on the 26th of November. I know we got it 2 days ago. But it does look. We'll look at that. What do I mean? Mortality, deaths, morbidity, disease. And so the first thing is to look at excess winter deaths. What are excess winter deaths? Well, they're the deaths that occur over and above what you would expect normally from the background. Does that make sense? They look at December to March, and then they see how many deaths above what they believe would normally have occurred, and then they give that a percentage, and that percentage is called the EWM, the Excess Winter Mortality Index, and you'll see it. And that excess winter mortality index also exists in different age groups. But generally, they've said now that this year there has been 31,000 excess winter deaths in 12-13. Right? Then they said, do you remember it was a 29% increase, which is true. It's a 29% increase because in 2012 it was 24,200. It wouldn't have been 29% increase if we were talking about 10 or 11, because that was 26,080. But if we go all the way back to 1999 and 2000, when we had a flu, not an epidemic, but we had increased flu rates, and that was the excess winter deaths there was 48,000. But we're now 10 years later in a place where there's lots of other variables that are going to come in and be talked about, such as the housing stock, albeit nowhere near where we should be, is actually getting better insulated, and so there's better insulation through. So that might be a factor. There's many of these things that come through. The reason why I'm telling you that is it's going to come in a little bit later on when we start talking about temperatures, because you would think that excess winter deaths, the colder the winter, the more they kill. And there is some truth in that, but there's more to the story. So anyway, another thing to remember, that from excess winter deaths, the two big players are circulatory and respiratory. And last year, it was circulatory diseases that did 40%, and then respiratory around 33% of the entire makeup of the excess winter deaths. In years gone by, that figure has sometime switched over, but they're the two big players, circulatory and respiratory. Okay, so let's have some facts. The Marmot report was published a couple of years ago, and the full report was published fairly recently, but the studies went on a couple of years ago, and it tried to inform the government and others, and again Greenpeace were involved in this, to say what was going on, what is the effect of cold and cold damp homes on our health. It's looking at population by age group, demographics, other social factors, income, and in the housing stock and the age of the housing stock as well. But I'm going to leave that a little bit later on. What it said, excess winter deaths, like I've said to you before, over and above what we expected through the summer months. Remember this, there's a low there is a relationship between low indoor temperature. When you start looking at outdoor temperatures, so colder winters, that's when it starts going away. That's when we can't quite match the two up. There's a correlation, but it's not that significant. But cold indoor temperatures, definitely. And 3 times as many of the, you're 3 times as likely to be one of the excess winter deaths if you live in the coldest quarter of housing rather than the warmest quarter of the housing stock when they have a look for the indoor temperatures again, yeah? Throughout the winter. And they say that overall excess winter deaths, the coldest of the housing sees 21.5% of them deaths, not necessarily all due to the cold, they just happen to occur in the coldest houses. So yeah, excess winter deaths. And as you can see, 1999-2000, we had a much higher raised influenza, and therefore that accounts for some of it. But also, they're also thinking that actually, what about the housing stock? Is it better insulated? Are people more savvy about how to keep the house warm these days? And because there's definitely something to do with how well a house is insulated, the indoor temperature, and mortality rates, excess winter deaths. As I said before, 40% circulatory, and 33% respiratory diseases. And these people could have had them conditions. It's the ones who wouldn't have died otherwise. Yeah. Morbidity. Let's talk about the diseases now. Circulatory, respiratory. But did you expect mental health? I don't know what the makeup of the audience is too well. So if you're all mental health workers, that's great. Oh yeah, knew that bit. But it was quite a surprise to me as well to actually when you see what the impact of this mental health is, and we're going to go into that now. But some facts about physiology. From studies done, lower than 16 degrees, and it appears to impair respiratory function. Coughs, wheezes. Lower than 12, put strain on the cardiovascular system. This is where we start getting into actually what it does to the cardiovascular system. You're gonna see it's an insidious risk, really, and hazard. It's as the temperature drops, everyone thinks hypothermia. It's going to be hypothermia. In my background, I was teaching soldiers how to spot the signs of hypothermia because it's very acute and it comes on. They don't notice it, but it's buddy and all that kind of things, and wind chill factors and being out in the. Yeah, they haven't got buddies in this. This is much more insidious. What happens is, the reason why it puts a strain on there is, as the temperature reduces, especially in the elderly, the blood pressure increases. Not only does the blood pressure increase, but also the blood thickens. Their arteries constrict and the veins constrict. So now we've got thick blood going through thinner arteries. That's going to put a strain on the heart, yeah? Does that kind of give you the picture? And so there are a much greater risk of stroke and thrombosis. Lower than 6 degrees, you start going into the land of hypothermia. And just like anything, the longer you smoke, the more chance you've got of getting lung cancer. The longer you're in a colder environment, the higher the risk of ending up with a disease or a health effect. So as I said, that's exactly what happens. Below 12, higher blood pressure, narrowing the arteries, thickening the blood, increased risk of stroke and heart attacks. And as you've seen this year, 40%, the last figures, 40% of the diseases, the excess winter deaths were circulatory diseases. So this is going on quite a lot. Right, what does it do? With respiratory diseases, we have We'll go a long time in this. Mucociliary escalator, little hairs, and then they cough things up. And there's a layer on you down in your throat, when you're breathing, and basically it gives you a little protection sometimes. The lower the temperature, that protection is reduced. And bronchoconstriction, increased mucus, coughing, and reduced mucal clearance, so things stay in there longer. One of the things they have noticed is, and especially when you start introducing things such as mould, which is having a cold, damp house, then spores that are forming, when they're breathed in, if you've got a reduced protection from your respiratory system, then the chances are you're going to take these contaminants further down into your lungs, into the breathing zone, and therefore you're not going to be expected to get upper respiratory tract infections. You're going to be getting them lower down. Lower down obviously means more complications, and what we've seen from that is more lower respiratory tract infections presenting at GP surgeries, and again a lot through the old. Yeah, that was one that shocked me when I was doing the research for this. 1.5 to 3 times more likely prone to coughing and wheezing. And then you start looking at the figures of what it's more likely for them to, if children live in cold, damp conditions for long periods of time, all the other effects that happen on them. You know, we talked about the elderly, but the 1.5 to 3 times more, 1.5 to 3 times more likely to have coughing and wheezing is also saying they've actually got more, it's also observed they've got more chance of getting asthma and having more asthmatic episodes as they go on. Mould itself can be an allergen and therefore trigger asthmatic reactions. I'm not saying everybody who coughs and wheezes has got asthma, but it's much more likely. And what they do find is that the people that have been in cold, damp environments throughout the childhood and manifest asthma are more likely to have it for the rest of their life. Mental health, again, something that shocked me is they looked at. There was a study that actually looked at people who adolescents mainly, because they could look at their examination results and then how they were performing at school, and they found that people that lived in a cold, damp environment, colder, it impaired their function. They did less well at school as they otherwise would have done to their peers in warmer homes. But this was a real shocker for me. Residents with a bedroom temperature of 21 degrees C are 50% less likely to suffer from depression than those with a 15 degrees C bedroom temperature. Warm front study, and that's chronic. Obviously, it's over a long time. Again, this is from the Marmot. This is from the Marmot report, accepted by government. So I'm talking to you about it. And then from the warm front study as well, but it was still contained in the Marmot review, and I think that's quite shocking. That 50%. That is not an insignificant number. It's half. You know, with 6 degrees in a room. Moving away from that, the amount of times I spent in rooms that are very, very cold, I actually prefer sleeping in a cold room. And it probably is about 15 degrees C, but it explains why I've gone so far in life. But it's not only that, it can also exacerbate as well, make things worse. Diabetes. Think about the things we've already talked about, the complications with thickening of the blood, constricted arteries. Then we all know somebody who when it's cold, has got a bad back, got the arthritis, and always old. You know this stuff, it's there, and the cold and the damp, it does exacerbate rheumatism. But going as well, when it's colder, your body slows down. If your body slows down and you're not getting the right food in there, and your body's not using the food, then the food is used, and your body is metabolism, and it generates heat. It generates its own heat, and that's how you can maintain it. If you're colder, you start going down, they have a poor diet, people forget to look after themselves, Parkinson's, dementia patients, they generate less heat and they get into a cycle and they start going downwards. less heat in a colder environment, yet more risk, increased blood pressure, blah, blah, and you can see for the elderly. It's a real risk for them. But just a little observation. One thing we didn't talk about is fully excess winter deaths. If it was something to do with the outside temperature, if it was how harsh our winters were, surely people that live in Scandinavia and further up with much harsher and colder winters would die. We'd see much more deaths. Would that be a fair assumption from what you'd think for excess winter deaths? No. They have a much better level of insulation in their housing stock, and therefore it's not related to the outdoor temperature. I want to get this point. It's related to the indoor temperature. It's the temperature you're exposed to. If you're not sat out, I mean, if you sat outside, fair enough, yeah, I expect you get a lot more deaths. But if you're inside and you're in these damp cold conditions, it's them, they're the ones. And if you look at Finland, Germany and the Netherlands, I'm just taking them three. It doesn't work everywhere. In fact, the really crazy thing is, in countries that have milder winters, Portugal, Spain, they have higher, not higher levels, but they experience a higher level to the population of excess winter deaths. And so the mortality levels you tend to find in where you've got better housing stock and especially better insulation, better indoor temperatures, then you just don't get the deaths. It's as simple as that. Everything else we can talk about is nuances. Indoor, an indoor temperature that's comfortable and an indoor temperature that's warm saves their lives. Thank you very much. I'll answer your questions later.